show you how you can be the pilot of this plane. So, just fly with me into After Effects. Hey, and before we set all of this up from scratch, I quickly need to tell you two things. First, if you have any questions, just leave me a comment and I promise I will answer all of them. And also, if you like what you see, hey, simply like it. And if you learn something, simply subscribe to my channel, because then more people will see this video and therefore YouTube will also show it to more people, and so I get motivated, or maybe even forced to do more of those tutorials. And second, the topic I want to cover this time is pretty intense, as we want to create a photorealistic animated background with some animated fog, some lens flares, as well as a 3D object and green screen element. So I decided on splitting this video into two parts, so they will be way more easy to consume, and you will find both links in the video description. So let's jump into the future and have a look what we are creating at part 1 and part 2. So at the end of part 1 you will actually have that scene, and as we are doing that interactive, you could later on fly over Las Vegas or over the mountains, wherever you want. Basically part 1 is there for you to learn all the workflows and to learn all the basics to bring this one step further in part 2. So let's also jump a little bit more into the future. So this is what you will end up after part 2 of this 2 tutorials. And this is not a rendering that you see, it's the live view in After Effects. So I'm just moving the camera around here. And you see that the sun, the plane, myself, everything is moving in 3D space. Also the background. And you can see the contrails or the smoke coming out of the airplane. And hey, even the sunlight is interactive. So when I bring it behind the plane, you see, super cool. And when I turn it around here, we also have some interactive sunlight going on. So without and with the sunlight. And this is fully 3D, so I could change the perspective to whatever I want, to a top view. All of that with motion blur and depth of field. So I really hope you are as motivated as I am now. And of course I'm also going to show you some tips and tricks along the way, and we will focus on particles in this tutorial, as I want to show you how you can use them in a creative way to create some moving clouds. And the cool thing about particle effects, all of them are set up in the same way. So once you understood how they work, you can master them all. For example, if you know how it works, you can change your clouds into contrails for the plane, which is exactly what we are going to do. And hey, you could even go one step further and create a waterfall with the exact same effect. Now, this time let's not jump into After Effects, because we are going to create the background in Google Earth Studio. And this is absolutely free. Simply type in earth.google.com/studio, hit OK, and here we are in Google Earth Studio, and therefore you need to be logged in into your Google account. Completely free to use, and this is absolutely mind-blowing. So in here we are really going to create the background that we later on will use in After Effects. And in the second part we bring all of this one step further, or even one dimension further, because we are going to do all of this in 3D, and therefore we will also create a 3D background in Google Earth Studio. So, but step by step. Let's start with creating a 2D background for our first scene. So we want to start a blank project, and we can name it 2D version. Dimension is 4K, and for the duration I'm only going to do 100 frames. Hey, and by the way, you can not only just jump to the Earth, you could also go to the Moon and Mars here, but let's stay on this planet and hit start. And it somehow looks like your After Effects interface. You have a monitor and you have some parameters where you can set keyframes. And over here you can simply click on that icon, and then we can search for a nice spot where we want to fly. So in my example here, I was flying over the Matterhorn in Switzerland, but maybe let's go to New York. So let's just type in New York, hit OK, and we will be directly in New York. And now you can navigate with your mouse by simply dragging it left and right. You can reposition it by using your mouse wheel. you can zoom in, and when you hold down the Alt button while doing all of that, you can rotate around everything and just give it a few seconds all the time to calculate all the 3D models. Now let's just look for a nice spot where we want to fly, and over here let's quickly go through all the settings that you can keyframe. So you have the camera position, the camera rotation, and the environment. And here you can also set the time and date. So the sun position and everything is exactly where it has been on that day. So you could always dig in deeper into the whole program, and then you could also set more parameters. But for now, let's stick with the default. And for the timing, I'm just going back in time, and let's have a look where we see the sun. Okay, it's coming up here. And yes, this is really, really looking nice, where the sun hits the horizon. We have the bridge in the front. Perfect. And as I want to fly pretty straight, I also set the tilt to 90 degrees, so the camera is straight up. And I just set a keyframe. You could click on all of those, but you can also click over here, and that will set a keyframe for all attributes. Perfect. So now let's just go to the end of our timeline here, and with our mouse wheel, we simply go back a little bit. Maybe just like so. So this looks like a really nice flight for our plane. And now all we need to do is to render that out. So let's click on the render button, and you can see we can now define a destination where we want this to render. And I've already set this to the fly tutorial. And don't mind, the quality will change when we render this. We can now define the frames. 0 to 100 is fine, we have already set that. And the dimensions, I want to go with the 4K dimension, because this is important. You could also render this in Full HD and type in 1920 by 1080, but in that way it will also use lower resolution textures for all its 3D models. So even if your final composition will only be Full HD, I would highly recommend you to render this one out in 4K, because the overall quality will look way better, and then you can simply scale it down later. So now you have the attribute position, and this is simply where the Google Earth logo will appear, because as I told you, this program is completely free. All you need to do is to mention that you have used it, and this is that watermark here. And for now, I'm just leaving it at the bottom right. And now comes the fun part. You could also render out an After Effects project with that. And in that way, you also get the camera and the camera movement. And you can also set null objects within that scene, but that's maybe something for another tutorial. For the map style, I choose clean, because I don't want to have tags and names and streets and whatnot. And the texture quality will be high. And I can already tell you that when we do all of this in 3D space, we are going to render the same scene as a 360-degree spherical image in an equirectangular format. But hey, we will get to that, no worries. So now all you have to do is click on Start. And now it starts rendering our 2D version. And one thing, be aware that while you are rendering that, you cannot open up another tab within your browser. So what I normally do is, because I have two monitors, I just put the Google Earth Studio on one monitor, let it render on that monitor, and in that way it will continue to render. But anyways, if you open up another tab, it will only pause, so you can always resume your rendering. And now this just takes a few minutes. This pretty much depends on what you're seeing in the image. If it's a landscape with only 2 buildings, then it will render super fast. But in this way, as we're flying over New York City, it has a lot of geometry to render. And look at all those details within the buildings. Looks absolutely perfect. So as you see, it takes about 3 minutes to render. So I'll just skip this, and we see us back in After Effects. And in here, let's directly import our footage that we have created. So therefore, simply double click into the project window, and here we now have our 2D version folder, and in it there's the image sources where you can find where the images are actually from. Then there is this script file for After Effects. So remember, you could load that and that would load the scene with a matching camera. But for this project we don't really need that, so let's just go into the footage folder, and there are all the images. And we want to import them as a JPEG sequence, so we click sequence, hit import, and by default After Effects opens this up as 30 frames a second, and I don't want that because remember, in Google Earth I set my project up to be a 25 frames per second project, so I can right click on that, interpret footage, main, and in here I want this to be 25 frames a second. Hit OK. And now, normally I would drag this onto the new compositions icon over here, but not today, because that would make a composition in the 4K resolution. But I only want a resolution in full HD, so I go to composition, new composition, and type in 1920 by 1080. And again, I want to have 25 frames a second. And you could also use the preset over here. That does exactly the same, and we have 100 frames. So now let's hit OK. And now let's drag our footage into here. And I can directly scale this down a little bit. And let's play this back in full resolution. And this is already looking pretty nice. Perfect. But now let's work on this a little bit to make it look more convincing. At first, this still looks a little bit like a computer game, because remember we have rendered each frame individually, so there's actually no motion blur on our footage. So let's just add motion blur by adding an effect called pixel motion blur. And we can drag that onto our JPEG sequence, and at the moment we have a default shutter angle of 180 degrees. So think of a shutter like a wheel, and now we only have half a wheel. So that means each frame, and we have 25 frames a second, gets exposed for half the wheel, so half the time. So now we have an exposure time of 1/50th of a second. This is what this is mimicking. And this is why you have the shutter as an angle and not as a fixed value. Because remember, I could also set this project at a 30 frames per second project, and then a 180 degree shutter would mean the half of it. So half of 30 frames would be a 1/60th of a second. Okay, the other numbers are pretty easy. We have this one frame, and then we have the next frame, and it creates pictures in between. So here you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 overlaying pictures, because from that frame to that frame, those would be the positions in between. So the more shutter samples you would create here, like for example 16, the smoother it would look. And the higher the detail, the more After Effects is trying to get hold of all the details within the image. And this already looks way better than without the motion blur. And also if it's playing back with motion blur, it would look way better than without. But I'm just going to disable it for now, because as I told you, it has to calculate 16 frames in between one frame. So this means it also takes 16 times longer to render. But as promised, I want to show you a little bit about particle systems, because they are really useful for so many things, from water to fog to clouds to really magical effects like fire, smoke trails and so on. So they are really powerful to understand. And I know when you open up a particle system for the first time, it looks a bit strange, and this is why I want to show you how you can master all particle systems. And for this tutorial I decided not to go with a plugin, so let's create a new layer by going to Layer, New, Solid, and call this one Particle. And hit OK. And in the effects and presets, when we type in particle, you see that After Effects comes with those 3 different effects. And at first you can see the bottom one, Particle Playground, only has 8-bit, so I would not recommend using that. Particle World has 16-bit and Particle Systems has 32-bit. So let's bring both of them out here, Particle Systems and Particle World. and you can directly see that we have one advantage because CC Particle World is a 3D particle emitter and CC Particle Systems doesn't have the 3D ability. And you can see that by that box here. So let's get rid of particle systems. But you can see that they are all built in the same way. They have a producer, they have particles, both of them have physics, they have a birth rate, and believe me, all particle systems out there work with the same principles. So to really understand this, let's make a quick lesson all about particle systems. And to make this super easy to understand, let's create a neutral background. And I'm already choosing a special particle here, which will be super helpful in understanding the idea of particle systems, because this cube is easy to see in size, color, position, and so on. So now let's go back from the particle menu and walk our way from top to bottom. And we will get back to the particle settings later. So grid and guides are simply the settings for grid and guides. So I'm not going over these as they have nothing to do with the effect, but only help you setting it up and aligning it better. So this will not appear in your render later on. So next is the birth rate. Yes, particles have a life. They are born, they have a longevity and also a death. So the birth rate is how many particles will be born within a certain amount of time. So when I go through this, frame by frame, the same amount of particles is born each frame. And when I bring up this number, there are simply more particles in the frame. And the longevity, which is next, will be defined how long they will live. At the moment it is set to 1 second, but when I bring this down to maybe half a second, you can see when you watch a single cube that it disappears or dies after half a second. And when I bring this up, you see they are visible throughout the shot. And another interesting thing happens, they change color. But we will get to that in a second. So next is the producer, and sometimes also called emitter. And this is the place where the particles are born. In this particle world effect, the producer is a sphere, and I can change its position as well as its radius. So in that way I can make them appear everywhere, even in depth, by increasing the Z radius. Hey, and remember, all of this is 3D. If we quickly create a new camera by going to Layer, New, Camera, and simply go for the default, you can now use the 1, 2, and 3 button to orbit, pan, and zoom in 3D space. Whoa! And this will be so cool in part 2 of this tutorial, so I would really recommend you watch the part 2 too. And you see that they all fall down. Hey, and this is because they have real-world physics. You see, at the moment they have a gravity of 0.5. And when I set this to 0, they don't fall down anymore. But they are still moving, because they also have a velocity by default. So let's also set this to 0. Now the particles stay at the same place from birth till death. And for example, if you bring the gravity to a negative value, they will not fall, but fly upwards. And most particle systems, also this one, have some pre-made animation presets to choose from, which usually determines the direction the particles spread out. For example, an explosion spreads in every direction, and a waterfall only has one direction. And now, last but not least, to understand the system, you have the particle tab, where you can choose the particle type and the look of the particle. We have a birth and death size, so if I set the death to 0, you see they all scale down over life. Same goes for the opacity, where you can even draw a map over life, and for the color. So now that we know all of that, let's create our clouds. So for the particle type, we want to have a faded sphere, and the color, of course, white or gray. And in the physics, I give them some velocity, as I want the clouds to pass by the airplane later on. And for the animation preset, I choose the directional axis, so they all move in the same axis. And now I need to rotate all of them by 90 degrees, so they don't fly sideways, but to the back. Okay. And now you can already see what we have. Some clouds everywhere in 3D space. So now let's increase the birth rate, as well as the producer radius, to spread the clouds out more. And now that we have the layout, let's make them bigger, and as a final step, lower the opacity so we can look through them. And here is a pro tip. If you go to the extra settings, you can find a depth cue, so they fade out in the distance, and you can even define the distance. And now I think it's the perfect time to end this particle lesson and to continue with our shot. And now we can pre-compose this by hitting Ctrl-Shift-C and call it our clouds. We want to move all attributes in there and hit OK, because now we have some clouds, but now I also want to mask them out, because they should only be in the lower part of the image, and then of course feather this a lot. Maybe even tint it a little bit in the color of the sky here. So therefore I'm just clicking on that color directly next to the horizon and then just go down with the amount to tint. So this is with and without. Perfect. And remember, you can always go in there, fine tweak your clouds layer and really get the look that you are after. But for now, I am pretty happy with that result. Okay, let me show you how I would create a 2D version out of this with just a still image and some green screen footage. And remember, the 3D plane will be right up next. So I'm going to render out the background, and therefore I'm turning on the pixel motion blur again. And here I have a really cool trick for you, because you can now go to composition, add to media encoder queue. This will automatically open up the media encoder for you. And now I'm going to show you a super cool trick, because I'm rendering this out as an image sequence. And why am I doing that? Well, that's because after the first image is created, I can already import that image back and directly start compositing without having to wait for the whole render to be finished. So here's the media encoder. I'm choosing something like a JPEG sequence and simply save this next to my 2D version as BG render 001. Hit save and start rendering. And you will directly see that because of the pixel motion blur, it will just take some time. And I would say maybe about 20 minutes for all of this. You see, it took about 27 seconds for just the first frame. But again, in here, I can double click, and in here I already have the first two images created. So I also import them as a JPEG sequence, hit OK, set them again to 25 frames, interpret footage main 25, hit OK, and I can already bring them on top of everything here. And you see, now I have the first two images, and I can now bring out the image of the plane as well as some green screen footage. So in here I have the plane and the green screen footage. Bring it in, and let's quickly click on the plane image. And you see, this is just an image that I actually created from the 3D model. So it's just a still frame, but hey, you can search in the internet for planes, UFOs, whatever you want to have, balloons, helicopters, you name it. And then you can simply use that as your asset. So I'll just drag it onto the BG render here. And you see, this is what we have now. So a few things we have to work on here. At first, let's simply take the clouds, duplicate them, and bring them on top. In that way, we have some depth. We have clouds, then the plane, and then behind that, even more clouds. And we can work on those, maybe offset them in time a little bit. And so what you can do now is always go into the background render, right click and reload footage. And now you see it has already rendered 6 frames, so I can already play this back. And you see, this looks really cool, but again, we have to work on this. You see, I have rendered the plane image with some depth already. So you see, it's super sharp where I'm supposed to sit later, but the back of it is already out of focus, and so is the front with the propeller. So we also have to go into our background render and add some out of focus to it. So we can do that with the camera lens blur and simply bring it onto the background render. And now you can see that the back of the plane is most out of focus here. So let's play with our settings here. By default, the blur is set to 5, and that's about right. We just need a little bit more. And here's a really important tip. A camera works in that way. It is out of focus in the front if you have something in the midground sharp, and in that way it's sharp over here, and then it gets out of focus again. But that is not symmetrical. So what I mean is the back of the plane is out of focus, but that does not mean that over here the city would be even more out of focus. Just think about that, and this is how I normally explain it. If you take a picture of the moon and you have something in the foreground, or you simply want to create a picture of the moon, it would always be so much out of focus because it would be even further away. And if the distance would always add to the out of focusness, so to say, you wouldn't be able to capture the moon or stars because they would simply be as much out of focus as possible. So it has a limit. What I want to tell you is that it has a limit. It is sharp at some point, and then depending on your settings, it takes a few meters to reach its highest out of focus point, but it stays at that point. So in that way, an out of focus of the back of the plane and the city is about right, just like so, not more. We are slowly getting somewhere. So let's bring out the green screen footage. And let's directly bring this onto the new compositions icon. And you see, I'm just sitting in front of a small green screen with some natural light coming in from the side. So I have really big windows in my living room here, and then I have a fan blowing wind into my face. And this is really nothing too fancy, so I can simply mask myself out here, go to key light, drag it on here, click on the green color, and now what I can do is click Alt+4 to see the alpha channel, bring up the screen gain just a little bit, and I could also work a little on the green color that I've actually picked, just to see which green color works best. And something like this really works fine. I have just some issues over here, but I can drag that in and feather the mask. And now for the screen matte, I'm just bringing that in a little bit and clip the black a little bit. Okay, let's just quickly scrub through this where we have like nice 100 frames, and I'm just trimming that. And back in our comp 1, let's bring in the green screen footage beneath the clouds but above the plane. And we can directly scale this to fit. And actually I don't have an idea how big I really should be, maybe something like that. Now I'm just going down with the transparency and mask myself out here. And I'm really just doing this in a rough way, and I would highly recommend to you to take more time for that. So now for the mask, hit M to get the properties and subtract it, and bring the transparency up again. And there are also two lines that I want to sit behind, and for the mask again I can select both of them and go to subtract. Now I am sitting in the plane, maybe also that top part. Now I'm slowly starting to fly that plane. So let's just do a few more tweaks, and remember, we are doing all of this already in preparation for the second part of this, the 3D part. In our green screen footage, I'm going to duplicate it because, as you have seen, in the composition, our sunlight is somewhere over here. So it's shining from that side onto my face and my hair. So let's fake that on our green screen. So for the top one, hit M, let's get rid of the mask and draw a mask where the light should hit my face. And this is on the hair, maybe a little bit over here, and definitely on the shoulder and around the arm here. Okay, and that should be super hot, so pretty warm, because we're getting a lot of warm sunlight. So we can take the lumetri color for that, because that has a color temperature built in. So for the basic correction, I have the temperature over here. So let's turn on both of them and bring up the temperature. You see what happens? And let's directly change the blending mode to something like pin light. And with the exposure, I can make it brighter. Obviously, this is just too much. And then, of course, I can simply play with the transparency of that. So color, temperature, exposure, and the opacity are your go-to points here. And you see this is with and without the rim light. And in the plane, this is what this looks like. So really cool to have that extra light over here. And maybe bring this in a little bit of another color direction. And you can do that with a hue and saturation effect and simply spin that wheel. You see? And now I'm just going for something more orange. Super cool. If you just take a look on my shoulder over here, so let's lock that composition, and I'm just turning this one on and off. You see? Just have a look at the shoulder, what this does with the lighting. I'm actually still not sure if I have the right proportions for that. But anyways, let's finish this off, and therefore I'm going to parent the green screen footage to the plane, and I can do that by pick whipping, and in that way this layer, the green screen footage, is connected to the plane. In other words, the green screen footage is the child of the plane. So when I move the plane now, you see that I am following along. So let's quickly animate this just a little bit so that it wiggles a little bit. Therefore I'm scaling this up just a little bit so we have some space to actually wiggle this around. And to make this wiggle, let's use the easiest expression ever. Hold down the Alt button and click on the position stopwatch and just type in wiggle, open brackets, and now you need to tell how often you want the wiggle to happen. So I want it once a second, then I hit comma, and how much do I want to have the position wiggle? Let's try it 20 pixels. So now let's play this back, and again the camera lens blur just takes a while to render, so I turn it off for now, and also the clouds. And what I could also do is bring out a levels effect, because all the light comes from the back. Maybe let's just take some of the white parts out of the image. And the same thing with me, so I can just hit copy and paste it onto my footage. Or even better, I cut out the levels effect again and just paste it onto the green screen footage where there's no light on it. So in that way the highlights stay as bright as they are, but I get a little bit darker. And this looks really awesome. So let's just drag this composition into a new composition, create a new adjustment layer by going to Layer, New, Adjustment Layer, search for the effect called Crop, and simply crop top and bottom about 10%. Now we have those nice letterboxes, and I'm actually going to bring the composition up a little bit, because that was distracting me all the time a little bit, that I have so much dead space on top here where there's nothing happening. So let's just bring it up, and I can easily do that with having the black bars at top and bottom. And this is where I'm going to leave you for part 1 of this tutorial. So my tip for you would now just be to grab a coffee, try out some of the stuff that I showed you today, relax for a few minutes and think about what you learned so far. Oh, and then directly go to part 2, where all of this will get way more intense and way more advanced. So I'm really happy to see you there in just a few minutes.